In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the religious influence that went into the war, which of course is kind of the theme of what we've been talking about all along. We've talked about religious influences such as the Puritans or the Great Awakening already. And the reason why we're continuing is because that story is so rich. You can, of course, ignore that story in American history, but you lose most of the story. You actually lose most of the motivation that went behind this American Republic. Well, today we're going to take a look at something called the Black Regiment. And the Black Regiment was not a regiment at all. What the Black Regiment refers to is it refers to the pastors, or sometimes called the parsons, that were there in the churches that were in favor of independence during the War for Independence. And they were called a regiment not because they necessarily took to the field. Often pastors did go with soldiers. Sometimes they merely were there as chaplains, which actually is a hugely important role, or sometimes they even bore arms themselves. But they were called the Black Regiment because these pastors were seen as so influential by the British and so ready and able to make their congregations go to war by pointing to them what was right in this case, that they were seen as a military threat. In other words, faith and religion were primary in this conflict. To give you an idea of this, let me read to you some quotations from the day about the influence of these men. Now, the first one here, this is by the famous Member of Parliament Edmund Burke. He said this in 1775. He said, "Religion, which is always a principle of energy, in this new people," referring to the American colonist, "is no way worn out or impaired, and their mode of professing it is also one main cause of this free spirit. The people are Protestants, and of that kind which is the most adverse to all implicit submission of mind and opinion." In other words, what he's saying is that because these people were Protestants, because they were not willing to see the Word of God taken from them or see the Word of God abused, especially by men of power, these people were quite willing to oppose tyranny even in the smallest ways as soon as they saw it. Here's another voice. This is by George Bancroft, one of the early historians of our country. He said, "The first voice publicly raised in America to dissolve all connections with Great Britain came not from the Puritans of New England, nor the Dutch of New York, nor the planters of Virginia, but from the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians." In fact, the Black Regiment was largely made up of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. These were men who had very distinctive views about what the role of government should be and the role of the church. In fact, specifically, they believed in what we call the two swords mentality. The two swords mentality means this. You have one sword that is the sword of the church. And it's not a literal sword, it's actually the Word of God. And the church has the duty to preach the Word of God, to use the Word of God in worship, to use the Word of God as a method of nurture. And so it's more of a spiritual sword. But then you have the state, which also wields a sword, and that sword is real, because the state has the duty, using force, to actually stop crime or stop invasion, any form that's going to threaten life, liberty, and property. As a result of that thinking, these Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, this Black Regiment went on, they said that if one man controlled both swords, then that one man would have too much power. This goes back to the Puritans. We talked about the same issue with them and with the Reformation as well. So it came out of that tradition and was one of the great driving forces in the War of Independence. Let me read to you a few more quotes, though. This was by Horace Walpole, who was a member of Parliament during the day. He said, "There's no use crying about it. Our cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." King George said this after he read the Declaration of Independence, even though it was signed by lots of men from different backgrounds. He said, "The Calvinist churches in America, those of the Reformation that were influenced by John Calvin, for example," he said, "they have gone wild." Ambrose Searle, who represented the Lord Dartmouth here in the state of New York, said, "When the war is over, there must be a great reform established, ecclesiastical as well as civil. For though it has been much considered at home, Presbyterianism is really at the bottom of this whole conspiracy. It has supplied the war with vigor and will never rest till something is decided upon it." And an unnamed Tory said this, "You will discover that I am no friend of Presbyterians, and that I fix all the blame of the extraordinary American proceedings on them. Believe me, sir, the Presbyterians have been the chief and principal instruments in all these flaming measures. Now, we're not going to point out that it was only Presbyterians, because it certainly wasn't. But they certainly seem to be the leaders. They certainly seem, through their ideas of the two swords, to really lead this move towards towards independence. That'd be men like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, for example. As a result, they estimate that out of the 3 million inhabitants of the Americas, some 2 million of them had a background connected to the Great Reformation. And out of those 2 million, some 500,000 were those Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. Many of them had fled here from the Scottish Highlands or from Northern Ireland because they had experienced the tyranny of England in their homelands. A tyranny which told them how they should worship and what laws they must follow, even if it did away with their culture entirely. That was, in many ways, the great influence of these things over here in the New World, and particularly in these colonies towards independence. This is also why the British were quite willing to target Reformed churches. In fact, we have on record that some 50 Reformed churches were burned to the ground. It was common for the British to confiscate the libraries of pastors or to take Bibles and hymn books away from these congregations that they saw as a problem. We have the stories, for example, of men like James Caldwell, who was a Scotch-Irish pastor. And Caldwell, who often talked about political matters from the pulpit, he actually showed how the church actually is to relate to the state, and he actually showed how the scriptures inform what a just government should be. His life was often threatened to such a degree that he often kept 2 pistols up on the pulpit next to his Bible, because he might have a shot taken at him during the course of a sermon. It was also Caldwell who would go through incredible tragedy as his wife would be murdered, and he himself would be on the run. During one such event, when the British were around a church that he was at, he told the men who were out of Wadding, the patriots who were defending this post, he told them, "Here, use these hymn books as wadding for your guns. You can keep firing at the British." And of course, the hymn books, which were largely made of hymns written by Isaac Watts, were torn up. That wadding was used in the rifles, and Caldwell famously said, "Give 'em Watts, boys, give 'em Watts," as they returned fire. He would later be executed, or actually killed in a misunderstanding, when he came across a British sentinel. But we also have men like the Reverend Samuel Doak, who himself was a Scotch-Irish pastor and educator. He was a great circuit rider throughout the West at that time, which was basically Tennessee and Kentucky. And he would travel from little village or settlement to other settlements and so forth, and he would be their pastor, often coming through only once a month. But he also brought things like a library, brought 500 books with him, and used that to found a college called Hampden-Sydney College. It was one of the first universities here in Tennessee. Not only that, but he was also the pastor at a place like Sycamore Shoals. Sycamore Shoals was the rally point for the Patriots of Tennessee and North Carolina before they went to the assistance of other fellow Patriots against the British at a place called Kings Mountain. And it was there that he read this, for example. Actually, he said this to his men. I'll read it to you. He said, "My countrymen, you are about to set out on an expedition which is full of hardships and dangers, but one in which the Almighty will attend you. The mother country has her hands upon you, these American colonies, and takes that for which our fathers planted their homes in the wilderness, our liberty. Taxation without representation, and the quartering of soldiers in the homes of our people without their consent, are evidence that the crown of England would take from its American subjects the last vestige of freedom. Your brethren across the mountains are crying the Macedonian to your help. God forbid that you shall refuse to hear and answer their call. But the call of your brethren is not all. The enemy is marching here to destroy your homes. Brave men, you are not unacquainted with battle. Your hands have already been taught to war and your fingers to fight. You have wrested these beautiful valleys of the Holston and Watauga from the savage hand. You will tarry now until the other enemy carries fire and sword to your very doors? No, it shall not be. Go forth then, in the strength of your manhood, to the aid of your brethren, the defense of your liberty, and the protection of your homes. And may the God of justice be with you and give you victory." That is why the Black Regiment earned its name. That is why the British military saw these parsons and these leaders as a military threat, because they recognized God's sovereignty. They recognized that every square inch of the universe is something that He controls, and a godly government is needed. Furthermore, they all recognize what we call total depravity. They recognize that man is completely fallen. His body, his mind, his heart, his will, it's all fallen and corrupt. And so when you put together a government, it has to have checks and balances. No one person can have too much power. But perhaps most incredibly, this Black Regiment recognized the whole idea of covenant. That whole idea that God's people appoint officers, and those officers have authority over them because God has also given them authority. He recognized that when those officers of the law, those men in authority, whether they be kings or governors or mayors or councilmen or judges, he recognized that when they violate or abuse their authority, they essentially are covenant breakers. They essentially are no longer fit for office and must be removed. That was what allowed these men, this Black Regiment, to so encourage those founding fathers, and especially those militias and that Continental Army that went to the fight. Often they were right alongside with them. We'll take a look at the two armies, the Army of Britain and the Army of the American Colonies, tomorrow.